I'm John Morrison. I'm the CEO of the Institute for Human Rights in Business. A couple of very quick opening reflections before I introduce the speakers. The first premise of just transition was perhaps, at least for us, and I think for everybody in this room, is just transition is no alternative to hard climate commitments. It's premised on net zero by 2050, halving emissions by 2030, and a planetary warming limited to 1.5 degrees centigrade above historic pre-industrial averages. So just transition is not a distraction from this. In fact, it's the consequences that flows from those commitments. The second premise for just transition is that at the center of this, and I know Sharan's work at ITUC here, are workers and worker rights, social dialogue, and the ILO core conventions. We go a little beyond that in our discussion with the business and human rights approach, and we welcome, for example, the statement of the International Energy Agency earlier this week. Many of you will have followed that, with their own commission's findings and recommendations around just transition. For us, it's affected communities and workers in the transition out, the transition in, and also questions of resilience and adaptation to the inevitable effects of global warming and extreme weather, like the built environment, for example. So I'll come back in a bit, but I'm going to give the floor now to Mary Robinson, the patron of IHRB, and many hats, Mary, chair of the elders, and also Sky TV broadcaster this week. And so Mary will be leaving a bit early because she's literally got to be on telly. But Mary, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, John. And thanks to the Institute for Human Rights and Business. I'm very proud of the Institute, and I hope we all are, for convening this session. And I'm happy that we have this opportunity to discuss addressing the climate crisis in ways that will ensure just transitions, both for workers and their communities around the world. I have to say that every time I speak publicly during these first days of COP26, I want to emphasize the importance of having the mindset necessary for a crisis, because we are in a crisis. And quite honestly, I don't think enough government representatives and heads of state, and maybe all of us, don't have that crisis mindset, which means that everything else is sort of less important. We're in a crisis, and that's the mindset that will help us in all sorts of ways at this COP. We all know what COP26 must achieve: an ambitious and credible pathway to meeting the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. And we all have a responsibility to help deliver the bold actions required. It's encouraging to see some progress, but the latest UN estimates suggest new government pledges would collectively only produce approximately 1/7 of the cuts necessary to help limit warming to the 1.5 degrees target. So we must demand more of our leaders. If we hope to move governments in the right direction, we must all demonstrate leadership as well. Those of you representing the highest emitting sectors, that means working in good faith to secure side agreements at COP26 on achieving a quicker end to the use of coal, dramatically reducing methane emissions. And it was good to see that global methane pledge today, and 100 countries signing up. And to use the transitions to cleaner forms of energy, stopping deforestation, another important announcement today, among other priorities. Over the next 2 weeks, we must also stress that climate adaptation becomes a much bigger priority, and the voices of those most affected by climate change must be heard more clearly than they have been previously. Presently, only around 20% of global climate finance is focused on adaptation. And that's frankly unacceptable. I've just come, as Sharan has, from a meeting of We Mean Business and the B team leaders, which Sharan and myself are both involved in. with the Climate Vulnerable Forum of 48 countries, and we heard a plea from Mohamed Nasheed and indeed from the President of Guyana for understanding the debt burden they have and the need for more support to help them become more resilient, and in particular to have more for adaptation. And why couldn't we do some swaps of debt for climate resilience? It was a very compelling argument, I felt. I welcome this opportunity to hear from all of you on how to provide the necessary finance and support for those most affected by the climate crisis. And I look forward to hearing about your plans for transitions to sustainable forms of energy that align with international commitments to human rights, to gender equality, and to the rights of workers everywhere. The new report by the Global Commission on People-Centred Clean Energy Transitions provides many practical recommendations, and Sharan, a member of the Commission, will tell us much more about this and the work she's doing with the ITUC colleagues around the world. At the heart of this just transition imperative is ensuring decent work and new opportunities, both for workers losing jobs in the transition out from carbon-intensive industries and for those in fast-growing industries at the centre of what we call transition in to more sustainable futures. So how do we see to it that necessary transitions produce win-win results for people and for the planet? One tool of note involves assessing corporate performance and encouraging a race to the top. I was pleased to see the launch yesterday of the World Benchmarking Alliance's first Just Transition assessment. It looks at the extent to which 180 influential companies in high-emitting sectors are transitioning to new business models with plans that include concern for workers and their communities. The results do hold out some good practices to build on, but the stark reality is that most companies are still falling far short of what is needed, and most aren't aligning climate actions with human rights, due diligence responsibilities. Another important tool is advancing the concept of the circular economy as part of rethinking use of resources globally. Transitioning to a circular economy will lower import demand for primary and secondary materials and lower exports of materials and waste. It will also help bring about new economic opportunities and new employment prospects in areas such as waste management, recycling, refurbishment, and remanufacturing, reuse, and repair. It is great to think of a world where we won't waste a third of the food in our world. Isn't that shocking, to waste a third of the food when we know about a lot of hunger and malnourishment and various other problems? As I often say, quoting my dear friend and former chair, he was one of my predecessors of the elders, Archbishop Tutu, he always described himself as a prisoner of hope, and I have adopted that. I'm not an optimist, I'm a prisoner of hope. I truly believe that in the midst of our current challenge, we have the opportunities for great creativity. We can integrate human rights and social concerns with climate transition processes and do more to support communities in adapting to climate change in ways that ensure fairness and equity. And that's our common challenge. And thank you again to the Institute for Human Rights and Business for bringing us together to have this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. Sharan Burrow, General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation, and really the originators, I guess, of Just Transition, or one of them. Sharan, would you like to take the microphone?
Well, John, I also want to thank and Mary, the Institute, because not just for convening us, but being kind of solid ground. The Institute provides that solid, principled leadership around business and human rights. And it really is the world we have to transition to, where all business, all investments are actually based on business and human rights, but also the environmental question, so ESG. And I want to come back to that question because there are some, Nick Robbins is in the room who spent so much time looking with us and many others at how you finance a just transition. But let's start at the beginning. What is a just transition? It is actually a matter of hope because it's a matter of trust. We know we're in a race against time, and John said to you, this is not about compromising. On the contrary, you know, we've been saying you can't lie to workers, you can't lie to communities. We are in a race against time and we have to do more than half of the job by 2030. But if we don't involve people in the planning and the destiny of their own future, if we don't have very simple just transition principles at the core of the way we design the transitions, then we won't win. We just won't win because fear is a great resistor. If you are frightened that you won't have a job, you can't put food on the table, you can't afford to buy your children's clothes or school equipment, or indeed just pay your transport to work, then you are going to resist change because what you have right now provides you at least some capacity for comfort. So just transition for us was a lonely fight. I was actually sitting here thinking about Copenhagen, and we went there with great ambition to support the climate targets, but to get just transition in the agreement. And we all saw, in fact, Mary described her questioning, I would say, our concern that government leaders are not doing as much as they can. They're not here with that mentality that says, we must get this done. And that's at Copenhagen, you actually saw them talking past each other. Paris was a slightly different proposition, but it was people like Mary Robinson, it was Lawrence Tubiana, it was, you know, those people who cared about people, who said human rights and just transition have to be in the agreement. And that's where it landed. But still a pretty lonely space. Now the fact that you're all here thinking about what it means to integrate the environmental standards and the social standards that actually matter to people is a great part of the future. So I just want to say, for us, it's very simple. People ask what just transition means. It means that you have to engage your workers and in turn communities where it's about community renewal. Because if you don't have a business plan or an investment plan that actually allows workers a seat at the table with their unions to negotiate what just transition looks like, then you won't have, in fact, the trust or the support for the business plan itself. So at the heart of it, it's jobs, jobs and jobs, climate-friendly jobs with just transition. We've been talking to mayors today because the C40 group of mayors is absolutely fundamental to reaching our ambition. And they understand if jobs are not at the heart of it, then we're going to lose. But beyond jobs, it means we have to admit that in some areas, workers will be displaced. So creating those jobs is fundamental. But where there is displacement, for older workers, it means secure pensions. For workers who are slightly beyond, just below retirement age, but want to transition early, it means transitions to secure pensions. For younger workers, it means what are the means by which you can provide income support as well as reskilling and redeployment support to the industries of the future or to the jobs of the future, because we say the industries of today are pretty much the industries of tomorrow. There'll still be energy, there'll still be transport, there'll still be construction, there'll still be agriculture. And then it means community renewal. In a simple statement, it means no stranded assets, but no stranded workers or stranded communities. And the IEA gave us a boost just this week, because when the IEA said, and of course led by, the Danish minister, Dan is an extraordinary leader, and when they said we need to make sure energy and just transition are seen as fellow travellers, hand in hand, because we've got to actually deal with a convergence of crises, historic levels of inequality and unemployment, and of course the transition with energy as the foundation. Every sector has to transition, but energy as the foundation. Then the recommendations show that working together we can actually make this happen. So I'm really grateful to all of you for being here. On the finance question, talk to Nick Robbins. He can tell you what our work is to actually say we must finance the transition, but we must also finance just transition. And I want to reiterate what Mary said. I think we're building a team here, but when I heard what I heard in that room next door, you know, there's $1 trillion in debt. Those vulnerable countries pay, I think he said, $1 billion every year. They're not asking for debt forgiveness. They're asking if, and by the way, some of them have paid back the debt in real terms many times over. They're now paying the interest. But what he was asking for is if 10 billion a year from the Maldives or equivalent communities could actually be halved. Could you, 10 million, could you spend 5 million on a climate resilience response, and indeed 5 million in paying back the debt? And the reality is you're better off taking the 5 million and helping the climate resilience project. $1 billion, sorry. It's very late and I resisted the wine. So, but you know, if you don't pay any, if you don't allow them to invest in the climate resilience, they won't be able to pay you anything. So let's get serious about collaboration and finance for the transition, financing just transition, creating those jobs, good jobs is at the heart of it. Thank you very much.
So next up, thank you, Sharan. Bernard Looney, the CEO of BP. Bernard, can you hear us okay?
John, I can hear you. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine, actually, Bernard. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Very good. Well, hello, everyone, and it's great to join you. And sorry I can't do so in person. Thanks for including BP tonight. We appreciate, obviously, being part of this conversation. And quite frankly and quite honestly, it's something that we don't take for granted. Mary, Sharan, John, thanks so much for your remarkable leadership on this and indeed on many other topics over many, many years. And Mary in particular, I'd be remiss not to thank you for your leadership of my home country, Ireland, but we're not here to talk about that. A few words from us on the just transition. And if I could offer, if it's okay, and we certainly don't have any right to say much here other than just to share some of our experiences, I'd just like to offer three perspectives, if I may. The first is a point about inclusivity. And I think it's Mark Carney who says, and I think he puts it very well, that to solve climate, we have to go where the emissions are. Some people seem to want to run away from the emissions, but we actually have to go into the emissions. And 70% of the emissions come from energy, as we've talked about, industry and transport. And of course, yes, we need more green companies, but we think, and I think many think, it's unrealistic to think we can grow and scale green companies fast enough. So we need to help the incumbent carbon intensive companies, call them polluting if you wish, to transition. Companies like ours, but also companies in steel and shipping, in aviation and so on. And quite frankly, we can only do that if there is a seat at the table. So thanks again for including us. The second point is that we have to transition, and Sharan's just been speaking to this, we have to transition in a way that no one gets left behind. Put simply, and I really believe this, there will not be a transition if it is not just. And that is not about being high-minded or idealistic, but as someone once said to I think it was a think tank analyst that was doing work on the topic of a just transition, they said, my job is worth more to me than it is in your spreadsheet. Work is deeply personal. And I know this myself from growing up on a small farm in the west of Ireland. Farming was much more than a job for my father. It was his life. He may not have understood the concept of purpose, but farming and work was his purpose. However much people want to change, and they do want to change, no one truly gets behind change that hurts them or that doesn't work for them. It's human nature. And therefore, to make the transition work, we have to make it work for everyone. And what's happening here in the UK at Net Zero Teesside, I think it's a great example. It's part of a massive clean energy program that has just received UK government backing. And it's going to work for the world, for the planet, by capturing around half of the UK's emissions from big industry and storing them under the North Sea safely. And it's going to work for the local community by supporting about, I think, 25 good jobs. And Mary talked about decent jobs, 25 good, decent jobs a year, every year, from 2023 to 2050. And it will work as a commercial proposition for people like BP and the partners in the project. And my third point, and you'll be glad to hear my final point, is that transitions are complex and they're messy. And quite frankly, no one can do this alone, and we certainly can't do it on our own, and we all need help. And fortunately, there are many brilliant sources of help. Industry organizations like IPCA, community organizations, trade unions like Sharan's group, and civil society organizations like the Institute for Human Rights and Business, and Mary and John's organization has helped BP enormously over the years with screening, with due diligence, with risk management, and more broadly helping us to do our best to respect human rights in everything that we do. And I'll be honest, we don't get it right every time, and we don't always get things right, but the IHRB does help us get better. And let me finish, if I may, with two important reasons around the Council for Inclusive Capitalism with the Vatican. First, because what the Council is doing to get everyone together, energy companies, commodity companies, renewables, the financial community, civil society. And second, and I think this is crucial, the Council has developed a framework to help companies through the complexity and the messiness. And Sharan is helping us with that. And any company starting out in a transition journey, you don't have to make it up as you go. There's a 4-part guide now, a how-to guide on workforce evolution, on community resilience, on collaboration and transparency, and it will be formally launched at COP this Friday. I believe I'm allowed to say that to everyone, and we're privileged to be helping with the Council on it. And look, I'll close, as Mary wrote in her book, Climate Justice, there comes a time when humanity is called upon to switch to a new level of consciousness, to reach for a higher moral ground. We have arrived at that time, and we must reach for that higher ground. So thank you, everyone. Thanks for including us at BP. John, back to you.
Thank you, Bernard. We now have a couple of government perspectives. So I'd like to welcome up Richard Lochhead, MSP, Scottish Government Minister for the Just Transition, Fair Work and Employment. Richard, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation to take part in this event with such an esteemed panel and audience, of course, as well. Welcome to Glasgow and Scotland and to COP26. And I was raised in Glasgow, but I represent Moray constituency in the north of Scotland, which includes Speyside, which is famous for Scotch whisky, because 50% of Scotch whisky comes from Speyside, and all famous brands are based there. And the Scottish Whisky Association were here earlier today outlining their plans for reducing the carbon footprint of the whisky industry. So irrespective of the fact you offered me a glass of wine when I come in here, which I very much welcome, I hope you'll have a chance to have a dram before you leave Scotland at COP26. And I've just hot-footed it here from the Scottish Parliament, and thankfully made it in time. And I was opening and closing a debate for the government on fair work. And I was speaking during that debate, and I was also mentioning the fact, of course, this was taking place against the backdrop of COP26, and fair work is at the heart of the just transition. So I'm Scotland's first just transition minister. I've also got responsibility for employment and fair work, as you've just heard. And my job is to work across government with all my colleagues to make sure the journey to Scotland's net zero targets, which are to be carbon neutral by 2045, is managed in a very just and planned way, and we do not have a cliff edge. This is not about turning a tap of things on and off. We have to make sure the transition towards net zero is just. And we established in Scotland a Just Transition Commission, which reported in March of this year, and we've adopted all the recommendations. And what we're going to do is publish a Just Transition Plan for each key sector of the Scottish economy, starting with the high emitting sectors of the Scottish economy. And of course, the first one will be energy in the next few months, because Scotland, of course, has a prosperous oil and gas sector in the northeast of Scotland, and therefore we are responsible for emissions and have played our role in global warming, and therefore we've got a duty and a responsibility in Scotland to play our role in helping the world get to net zero, and of course making sure there's climate justice. And we are also funding, as a Scottish Government, climate justice projects in the global south as well to help play our part there. It's absolutely essential that people working, for instance, in fossil fuel sectors like we have in oil and gas in Scotland, are at the heart of the transition. I know that people I represent my constituency and the wider region of North East Scotland are very anxious at the moment because they know that their jobs in fossil fuels, but they're also excited to an extent of what they can do to transfer their skills into low carbon and zero carbon sectors and renewables. And therefore, as a government, we know we've got to put our money where our mouth is, and there's £500 million going into the North East of Scotland alone over the next 10 years as part of the economic transformation within Scotland to support people to upskill and reskill. And as part of our just transition plans, the employees absolutely have to be at the heart of co-designing the just transition plans. So we're working closely with the trade unions in Scotland, the business community, third sector organisations and government agencies, and all coming together around the same tables to design those just transition plans to make sure the journey from here to net zero is achieved to save humankind and the planet, and we hope the agreements are achieved over the next few days here in Glasgow, but also it's done in a fair and just way. And we use the economic transformation and the just transition also as a gateway to tackle deep-seated inequalities in society at the same time. This is an opportunity to address all of that at the same time, so the business community working with the rest of us can achieve that to make sure it's good jobs and green jobs is all part of the just transition. So that's the perspective from Scotland.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to congratulate the Scottish Government for its leadership on the issue, definitely. We have another government perspective now. Maxine, Burkett. Dan Feldman is John Kerry's Chief of Staff. Dan might appear apparently over drinks at the end, but he very kindly stepped in to take his place. I believe Secretary Kerry is rather busy. The microphone is yours, Maxine.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to join all of you this evening for this conversation. I should say that I'm here, in my capacity as Senior Advisor to the Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry. I also want to acknowledge my colleague, Sharan Baker, who's the first Deputy Director of Energy Justice at the Department of Energy in the United States, which I think is an embodied example of the shift that we're seeing in our administration and when it comes to these critical issues at this time. I was a law professor in my previous life, so brief remarks mean something very different to me. So I will say that I'm going to work off of my written comments so that I can keep within a reasonable time. But I do want to just note that just this weekend, Spec Kerry, we call him Spec Kerry informally, said the same thing he said in many ways over the last 8 months, that the losses individuals and communities are suffering are real. They're happening right now. And in many places, they've already caused unprecedented upheaval year after year. And to galvanize the kind of global action needed to accomplish our appropriately ambitious goals, we need to be sensitive and thoughtful about the people and people up and down the economic food chain, and people who have done nothing in most cases to contribute to the problem. We understand that to be true in our relationships between countries, but we are acutely aware of the needs within our own country as well. The front lines of climate change cut across our tribal nations, our rural poor, our communities of color who suffer from extreme heat to unprecedented storms while enduring multiple and often simultaneous disruptions in between. So from day one, President Biden has taken decisive domestic action and provided global leadership on climate change. And this includes many examples among the sort of probably the most basic, which was to return to the Paris Agreement on day one. But he's also moving to accelerate clean energy development on federal, rural, and tribal lands and along the coastline with offshore wind. We're also seeking to increase assistance to states and communities to proactively reduce vulnerabilities to natural hazards. And this additional funding will help communities prioritize mitigation needs for a more resilient future, including in underserved communities that are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. I'd also like to sort of drill into two specific examples of how this administration is taking those uneven impacts of climate change, its effects, the direct effects, as well as the byproduct of our efforts to decarbonize, how we're taking that seriously in policy and practice. First, President Biden's historic Justice for the Initiative, which commits 40% of the benefits of climate and clean energy spending to disadvantaged communities. And the goal is to achieve net zero emissions economy-wide by 2050. And that's provided an unprecedented opportunity to create new jobs across multiple economic sectors and help to realize the administration's intersecting priorities on climate, equity, and the economy. Second, coming into COP26, the president announced the Build Back Better framework. A $555 billion investment, representing the largest single investment in our clean energy economy in history across buildings, transportation, industry, electricity, agriculture, and climate smart practices across lands and waters. The framework will set the United States on the course to meet its climate targets, achieving that 50 to 52% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions below 2005 levels in 2030 in a way that grows domestic industries and advances environmental justice. Among other things, it will advance EJ through a new clean energy and sustainability accelerator that will invest in projects around the country, again, while delivering 40% of the benefits of that investment to disadvantaged communities. Under President Biden's leadership, the United States is mounting a whole of government response to the climate crisis, and this is alongside a whole of government equity agenda. Every US agency is a climate and equity agency, and we're also rallying the private sector to mobilize the investment and technologies needed to promote a prosperous net zero US and global economy. For far too long, environmental policy decisions have failed to adequately account for environmental injustice, including the disproportionate, disparate, and cumulative impacts of pollution on our most vulnerable communities, including tribal nations, low-income communities, communities of color. President Biden is making clear that this administration will chart a new and better course, one that puts environmental and climate justice at the center of all that we do. Thank you.
Thank you, Maxine. And we'll get into the discussion. I'll be handing to Mark from EBRD to kick us off in a second. Really, what we want to do with the rest of this session, Mary's going to leave. Give them hell, Mary. Take no prisoners. We've really gathered a sort of mixture in this room. It's a bit of a multi-stakeholder group. We have, amongst businesses here, I think we have the finance dimension, but we also have demand and supply. And apparently that's quite unusual to bring the demand and supply pieces together around corporate energy use, but also public procurement around energy as well. We think there's the possibility of people working more closely together, and there might be some leverage points there. From the demand side, we acknowledge initiatives like the Climate Pledge that some of your companies have signed up to, but also note there's no social component to that. It's purely environmental moment. From the finance side, we note TCFD, for example, but there's no social risk component. They're either the EU taxonomy has some reference to business and human rights, but it's not the deep one. Of course, on the supply side, as we've heard from Bernard, there is more experience from some of the traditional energy companies around human rights. But the issues like land, indigenous peoples, for example, isn't, is perhaps a new issue for some of the renewable energy companies. And when you dig deep into some of the commodities that are required for this revolution, like copper, for example, there's a lack of vertical integration on some of these social issues from mine through to wind farm. So I think there's a lot to be done. There really are some social gaps. We tried to identify some of those in the paper. And the questions in the paper, which I really hope you will help us answer in the next 45 minutes. Participation, right? Human agency. How do we involve the very people like the workers and the citizens and the voters in the decision making that affects their lives? How do we give people some level of agency? The second is, how do we integrate human rights, both from a business perspective, how do we share that learning, but also from a government side around legislation, mandatory human rights due diligence, etc. And the third is, whilst at the macro level, we need governments to lead with industrial policies, and I think we've heard from the US and Scotland examples of that, what can be done in addition, particularly at the local level, in terms of multi-stakeholder action that will really transform and affect the lives of individuals.